So hello everyone, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm just going to put this here. This is a really impressive crowd for this event, and I'm going to talk about knowledge. You know, there are many things that are important in education. We've been hearing about some of them, but if you're not teaching something substantive, none of them will really work. So what we're going to cover, a number of things related to that. First of all, why it's impossible to teach critical thinking skills, analytical skills in the abstract, generally. Also, why it is so crucial to build students' knowledge, as Catherine was talking about. You know, you have to supply students with knowledge, you have to cover subjects like history, geography, and science, and you need to start early, and we'll talk about why. And we're also going to talk about writing instruction and how that is not just an important skill in itself, but also a very powerful way to build, to deepen, and help students retain knowledge. And then lastly, why is it important to connect the different aspects of literacy? So not just reading, not just reading and writing, but also speaking and listening and how they all work together. So we all hear a lot about these 21st century skills, you know, creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication. These are all important things. We want children to acquire these abilities. And especially, we have this in the United States, where I come from, but also we focus a lot on what are called reading comprehension skills and strategies. And they're similar. They're things like finding the main idea, making inferences, making predictions, determining cause and effect. And some of these skills and strategies are metacognitive. If you were here for the last session, you heard about the importance of metacognition. So things like monitoring your comprehension, asking yourself, am I really understanding what I'm reading? So we spend a lot of time on these things in the United States, and we do try to teach them directly. So the theory is that it doesn't really matter what students are reading, as long as they are developing these skills. So the teacher might read a book to teach the skill of making predictions, doesn't really matter what it's about. Then students go off to practice the skill. Maybe there's a different skill each week. Students go off to practice the skill, reading books on all sorts of different topics. Doesn't matter what they're reading, and the books are easy enough for them to read themselves. And the idea is if they really get good at something like finding the main idea of a text, they will be able to apply that skill to find the main idea and gain knowledge from any text they read, no matter what it's about. Maybe it's in high school or college. If you're good at finding the main idea, you'll be able to find the main idea. So we're going to just very briefly test out that theory. I'm just going to show you a paragraph from a newspaper, and it will be in Spanish for you. And I'm going to ask you to find the main idea. Just think, what is the main idea? So here goes. I'll give you a minute. Any volunteers? So what I didn't tell you is this came from an American newspaper. And this is describing an American football game. So what we call football is different from what the rest of the world calls football. And if you know about American football, you have no trouble understanding this. But if, like, I may be the only American who does not understand American football, even if this was in English, I couldn't understand it because I don't know anything about American football. So it's not that you can't decode the words. You may understand some of these individual words, but what does this mean? What does it add up to? So this is something that cognitive scientists who study reading comprehension have known about for a long time. So back in the late 1980s, there was a study. What is more important to reading comprehension? Is it a general skill like finding the main idea, or is it how much the reader knows about the topic they're reading about? And so this study has come to be known as the baseball study. So why baseball? These researchers were doing this experiment with 7th and 8th graders, and they thought, well, there are probably a lot of children out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they divided these students into 4 groups, depending on how well they scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave all of these students a passage to read describing part of a baseball game, and they tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was that what really made the difference to comprehension was how much a student knew about baseball. So this green bar, those are the poor readers, according to the test, who knew a lot about baseball. These are the good readers, according to the test, who did not know much about baseball. And so you can see the poor readers did a lot better when they were reading about a topic they knew about. They had no trouble understanding. So this may be fairly obvious. It's helpful to know about the topic when it's a subject like baseball or American football or molecular biology or something that has its own special language terms. If you know those terms, it's going to be easier to understand. What may be less obvious is how much we rely on our general knowledge, especially more academic knowledge, to understand everything we read. So it has been found that if you know, there's a very strong correlation between knowing the answer to a question like, in what part of the body does pneumonia occur? And general reading comprehension. The more stuff like that you know, the better your chances of understanding anything you try to read. And of course, we want students, ultimately, we want them to have that general academic knowledge because that's what's going to enable them to understand texts on topics they don't already know about. But how do you help them acquire that general academic knowledge and vocabulary? It doesn't work to teach it in the abstract. Vocabulary doesn't stick unless it has a meaningful context. So really, the only way to help them acquire that general knowledge is through knowledge of lots of specific topics. And there have been studies showing that for something like critical thinking, for example, and it's not just reading comprehension, the more knowledge you have about a topic, the better able you are to think critically about it. So, for example, there was a study with doctors, neurologists and cardiologists. So they're all doctors, they all have medical knowledge, but the cardiologists have more knowledge of cardiology. So they gave all these doctors some cardiology cases to review. And they gave all of these doctors some time to review them. And even though the neurologists had a medical background, the cardiologists did much better at thinking critically about these cases and making inferences. So this is very well established, that the more knowledge you have about a topic, the better you are able to think critically about it, to make inferences, et cetera, all of these things that we want students to learn how to do. Well, why? Why does prior knowledge help so much with these, what we call skills? They're not really skills like riding a bike, right? Because if you learn to ride a bike, it doesn't matter what bike you're riding, you can ride a bike. But when we're talking about a skill like finding the main idea or critical thinking, whether you can apply that skill will depend partly on your prior knowledge. So why is prior knowledge so valuable? What is going on in the mind? Well, it really has to do with this aspect of consciousness we call working memory. So working memory is where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. learning, in other words. The important thing to know about working memory is that it's very limited. It varies between individuals, but generally it's been found it can only hold maybe 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to get overwhelmed and we start to lose the ability to understand what we're trying to take in. And that burden on working memory is called cognitive load. So too much cognitive load, it gets it harder to understand and to learn. So there is a way around the limitations of working memory, and that's long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. And so if we have relevant information already stored in long-term memory and we can take it out when we need it, we don't have to juggle that in working memory, and that gives us more capacity in working memory to take in new information. So if you're reading about American football, you already know what a punt means, which I don't. You don't have to think about that. You don't have to look it up. You can just attend to the new information in whatever you're reading. So there are a couple of tricks here, though. First, you need to transfer new information from working memory to long-term memory. You also need to be able to retrieve that information when you need it. So what helps with transfer is to attach meaning to new information, and a great way to do that is to talk about it to someone else in your own words. For retrieval, what helps is to practice retrieving an item of information, retrieval practice. And there are different ways to do that, multiple choice quizzes, but a really good way is to talk about it, explain it to someone else in your own words. So we will come back to those ideas, but for now, what does all this mean for teachers, for education? Well, a number of things. I've got 7 different points. Let's start with skills can only grow alongside knowledge. So these, as I said, they're not pure skills like riding a bike or like decoding words. So you can't really just teach them in the abstract. It doesn't matter. Let's teach critical thinking. What are they thinking about? It doesn't matter. We're teaching the skill of critical thinking. No, if you want students to learn to become critical thinkers, the only way to do that is to build their knowledge. And as they are acquiring information, you ask them questions, get them to think about it in a critical way. But you need to start with the knowledge. And the more general knowledge they're able to acquire, the more likely they are to be able to think critically about a lot of things. So that's an important point. And so, for example, this is an experiment that was done in the United States, I think, maybe Canada. Students were shown, I think they were in 7th or 8th grade, they were shown this website about the Pacific Northwest tree octopus. And this was supposed to be an octopus that can live in trees. And this website had scholarly citations. It looked very legitimate. And they showed this to a bunch of students who were actually these students had pretty good internet skills. They were supposed to be good at distinguishing true from false information. Only 6 out of 53 students were able to say, no, this is not true. There is no such thing as a tree octopus. And if you have some knowledge about the octopus, you're probably more likely to say, wait a minute, I don't think this makes sense. So, it's important to give students internet research skills, but this is going to be probably the most valuable thing you can do if you want to protect them against believing false information. Build their knowledge. Second, make sure that students actually have literally understood what you have taught. It's true, students should be free to ask questions, they should be encouraged to ask questions, but sometimes they don't want to because they don't want to look stupid, but sometimes they think they've understood something, but they have not understood what you have taught. So for example, this is somebody I know who is a high school history teacher. He was teaching about the American Revolution to his high school students, had spent a week or 2 on the American Revolution, and a student finally raised his hand and said, wait a minute, we're fighting against the British? After 2 weeks. And some other students were like, yeah, we're against the British. So that teacher came to realize it is very important to make sure the students understand the story, what happened first. And then, because you can't think critically about the American Revolution if you don't know who the Americans were fighting. Third, make sure that students have actually retained, not just understood it correctly, but also retained what you've taught them. You want it to get into long-term memory. So how can we help that happen? Well, I mentioned retrieval practice. And this is a classic study of retrieval practice. In this study, college students were shown, they were given an article to read about sea otters, and they were then divided into 4 groups. So one group read it once, one group read the article twice, one group did something called a concept map of the article, and the 4th group engaged in retrieval practice. In this study, what that meant was they wrote down everything they could remember about the article after they read it. And when all of them were tested a week later, those who had engaged in retrieval practice, who had written about it, remembered far more. So that is a really good way to ensure that students, they don't always have to write about it. Asking questions, quizzes, the more you practice retrieving an item of information, the more likely you are to be able to get it when you need it. And that will open up more capacity for learning new things. So, 4th, it's not that you can never bring in skills or strategies. It's okay to ask students to find the main idea, to make an inference, but what's important is that the specific content should be in the foreground, not the skill or the strategy. So in the United States, sometimes teachers, there'll be a skill of the week. Let's say it's making predictions. So how do teachers teach students to make predictions? Well, they might give them a worksheet like this. This is appropriate because this is about a student in a school gymnasium. We are in a school gymnasium. But I'll just say, Peter was in the school gymnasium. He was standing on the balance beam. He took a few steps and lost his balance. And then students are supposed to predict what happens next. And this is supposed to equip them to make predictions about very sophisticated things they will be reading in the future. But just because you can make a prediction about a student who falls off a balance beam doesn't mean you'll be able to make a prediction about who's going to win the American Civil War or whatever. You need that knowledge. But if you can ask questions about the content you are teaching that bring in a skill or strategy if it's appropriate to help students think about that content, and that gets them in the habit of that kind of thinking. It's a habit rather than a skill, because a habit, we want students to think, what's going to happen next? But if you don't have enough knowledge, you might not be able to answer that question. But here's an example from real life of how to bring in a skill like that in a way that will work. So instead of using a text to teach a skill, use a skill to help students think about a text or a topic. And let's say you are teaching about the myth of Daedalus and Icarus, and I was in a 2nd grade classroom where the teacher was teaching about, Icarus flew too close to the sun, and his wings melted, and he fell into the sea. Daedalus, his father, had attached these wings. So the teacher asked the students before they got to the end of the story, what is Daedalus's plan? So she was asking them to make a prediction, but she didn't say, okay, now we're going to learn how to make a prediction. But they were able to do it. They were able to think in that way. And I'll show you some more examples from that classroom in a minute. They were using an unusual curriculum for the United States that really does focus on building students' knowledge. And here's another example from that curriculum, which is called Core Knowledge Language Arts. And it's being used by more and more schools, but still a minority. And there are also some other curricula now in the United States that focus on building students' knowledge rather than on these skills, just general skills. So the next thing is to build knowledge in a logical sequence so that students, if they're in 5th grade and they're expected to learn something, they already have the knowledge required to understand the new thing they're expected to learn in 5th grade. And you can see this maybe most clearly in history. It's hard to understand the American Civil War if you don't know anything about what happened in the United States before the American Civil War, right? So in this particular curriculum, in grade 1, there's studies of ancient civilizations that they study other things too, but I'm just picking these particular topics. So you can see that there's a thread that goes through this curriculum. So in kindergarten, in 1st grade rather, they've got Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, early American civilizations, and then in 2nd grade, they go on to India, ancient China, and ancient Greece. So one day in class, I was writing a book, I was observing this class, and the teacher asked, so they'd already learned about these other civilizations, and the teacher asked, what was something unique about ancient Greek civilization? And these kids are 7 years old, but all of these hands went up, and she called on one little boy who came from a Spanish-speaking family, actually. So most of the kids in this classroom were from immigrant families who did not speak English, and some of them were still learning English. All the children were from low-income families, but they were having amazing discussions, and they were using vocabulary you wouldn't believe. So this one little boy that she called on, his answer, well, they weren't near a river, and they didn't have any fertile soil, so it was difficult for them to farm. He could not have answered that question. I mean, this was a question that called for the skill, you could say, of comparing and contrasting. But the only reason he could compare and contrast was that he had all this knowledge about ancient civilizations. So that's the way to equip students to think in this analytical way. Number 6, we want to begin building this knowledge early. We don't want to wait until higher grade levels. Why? Well, prior knowledge does not just help you understand what you're reading, it also helps you retain new information from what you're reading. It has been said, knowledge is like mental Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. Some children, usually those from more highly educated, more affluent families, they're starting out with more of that other half of the Velcro, more academic knowledge and vocabulary. They're reading more sophisticated books, but also they are able to retain more information from those books, new vocabulary, because it has something to stick to. And that enables them in turn to read yet more sophisticated books. So it could be kind of a virtuous cycle for them. But the other kids who start out with less of that other half of the Velcro, they're probably reading simpler books, but even if there's some new information in those books, they're less likely to retain it because it probably doesn't have anything for it to stick to. And what this leads to is something that has been called the Matthew effect in reading. That's a reference to the Gospel of St. Matthew, the part that says, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So every year that goes by, this gap between these two groups of readers gets wider and harder to narrow. And that's why it's so important to begin building knowledge early. So, number 7, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on writing because it's so important and we don't spend enough time thinking about it, teaching it. But so number 7 is to teach students to write about what they're learning. And this, in the United States, is often approached as like reading comprehension skills, something you teach directly, the skill of. This one is supposed to be teaching the skill of opinion writing. And it doesn't matter what they're writing about, as long as they're learning how to write opinion pieces. So this is from maybe 1st grade, an opinion piece, do you like Skittles or M&Ms? And I mean, it's, maybe that's appropriate for 1st graders in some ways, but the idea is this is going to prepare them to write an opinion piece about the causes of the Civil War or whatever later on in high school. But just as with those reading comprehension skills or those 21st century skills, they don't transfer from one situation to another. Whether you can write an opinion piece about the causes of the American Civil War depends a lot on how much you know about the American Civil War. So here's an example of connecting writing to the content students are learning. This is again from that core knowledge language arts curriculum. In 3rd grade, students learn about the Vikings. And so one of the questions that they need to answer in writing is, how did living by the sea influence Viking people's lives? This is calling for analysis, maybe opinion, but they have the knowledge to answer this question. So you have to combine these things and not think of writing skills as something separate from content knowledge, because it's not. And I'm going to go back to that experiment on retrieval practice and remind you that the students who wrote about the article remembered it best. Those were college students, but there are many other studies, including studies with students in kindergarten through 12th grade, that also show the power of writing about content to help students learn. So this is one meta-analysis. There were 56 different studies of students kindergarten through 12th grade, and they wrote, not in English class, this is looking at writing in science, social studies, and mathematics. And they found, just as they had predicted, writing about content reliably enhanced learning, and there was a pretty good effect size. So students retained information, they understood it better if they wrote about it. So we need to connect these things. So why is writing potentially so powerful to boost learning? Well, it has to do again with the cognitive architecture of how we take in new information, working memory, long-term memory, but especially those processes of transfer and retrieval. Remember, for both of those things, what really helps is to explain the information to someone else in your own words. And that's what we do when we write. So it helps with both of those things. And writing can also really build analytical abilities. The things we try to teach in the United States through reading comprehension skill and strategy practice, or critical thinking practice, writing is a very powerful way to develop those things, because when we write, we are doing all of these things. We have to find the main ideas and supporting details. If we want to write a paragraph, we write a topic sentence, we have to find the main idea. We have to make inferences. We compare and contrast. We connect claims to evidence, all of these things. So writing is potentially very powerful in helping with that. And another thing that writing can do is to help familiarize students with the complex syntax of written language. The sentence structure of written language is almost always more complex than the sentence structure we use when we have a conversation. And if you're not familiar with that kind of syntax, even if you can decode the words, maybe you have a good vocabulary, but if you don't know what the syntax is, what it's saying, then you're going to have a problem with comprehension. So for example, I came across a study involving a 10-year-old boy who had average decoding ability. He could decode the words, but he struggled with comprehension. So the researcher in this study read the boy the following sentence. Rachel Carson, well, I won't read it because I'll be doing it in English, and so you can read that. And Rachel Carson is the author of this book about pesticides, Silent Spring. So then the researcher asked the boy, what do you know about Rachel Carson now? And he said, they grew up together in the same place. How did he get that answer? Well, it has to do with syntax. So this phrase, this is a structure we use in written language, but we don't use it when we speak. It's called an appositive in English. It's a phrase describing a noun. But because the boy was not familiar with this kind of structure, he thought these were three different people. He thought actually there were four different people in this sentence, and they all grew up together. And you might think this is strange, but the researcher said, no, this is very common. Students, if they're not familiar with the syntax, they look at the noun that's closest to the verb in a sentence, and they think that's the one that goes with the verb. So, and it's actually quite widespread. So what can we do about this? Again, writing is really very helpful to familiarize students with complex syntax. If you can use a structure like this in your own writing, you're much more likely to understand it when you see it in reading. So you could teach students what an appositive is, and you want to, when you're introducing that concept, you want to do it in the context of familiar content. Again, so they're not juggling too many new things in working memory. I mean, once they have that concept, and once they've learned something about Rachel Carson, then you can give them this sentence to complete. So now, they have to supply the appositive, they have to retrieve information from long-term memory, they have to know it, maybe they slightly forgot about it, and now they're practicing retrieving it. So this kind of activity teaches writing skill and reinforces knowledge at the same time. In fact, writing is potentially so powerful that it can even compensate for very large gaps in Velcro, in background knowledge, even at higher grade levels. It makes new information stickier. The problem is that writing is also the hardest thing we ask students to do, I think, in school. And the reason for that, again, is working memory. Remember, it's limited in what it could hold, and too much cognitive load, you start to lose your ability to understand. And inexperienced writers may be juggling many, many things in long-term memory at the same time, or trying to. So how to form the letters, how to spell the words. In English, that's harder than in Spanish. Which words to choose, how to organize your thoughts, understanding the content you're writing about, and using that peculiar syntax and vocabulary of written language. And all of this creates not just cognitive load, but also stress. And as we heard in the last session, if you were in here, stress is also a burden on working memory. So it's very easy for students to become overwhelmed if we ask them to write, especially if we ask them to write at length, and they're not experienced writers. And then they will not get the knowledge building, knowledge deepening benefits of writing, and they also probably won't learn to write well. So what we know is writing instruction has enormous potential power, but we haven't unlocked that power. One, because we've underestimated how hard it is. Two, because we have tried to teach it in isolation from content. In the United States, we have kids, writing about Skittles and M&Ms, or the trip to grandmother's house that they took last weekend, or maybe topics in a separate writing curriculum. But we're not using writing to reinforce the knowledge we want kids to retain. Also, if you don't know much about the topic you're writing about, it's not going to work. You can only write about topics you have some pretty good amount of information about. And then in the process of writing about those topics, you deepen that knowledge. So what do we need to do to unlock the power of writing? 3 things. First of all, we need to modulate that heavy cognitive load that writing imposes. And that could mean starting instruction at the sentence level, if that's what students need, no matter what grade level they're in, because if writing is hard, writing at length only makes it harder. Second, we do need to teach grammar and conventions, the conventions of written language, explicitly, but for many students, it only works to do that in the context of their own writing, not the rules in the abstract. And that's, again, where starting at the sentence level is very helpful, because if you have 5 pages full of mistakes, where do you begin? If you just have a few sentences, it's much more manageable. And then lastly, we need to embed writing activities in the content of the core curriculum. And I know of only one method that does all of these things, and that's the Writing Revolution. This is a book that I co-authored, but the method, the Writing Revolution method, was created by my co-author, Judith Hockman, who is a veteran educator, and she created this over many years. I don't have time. Unfortunately, the book is still only available in English, but I'm hoping there may be a Spanish version at some point. And I don't have time to go into it in detail, but I want to just give you an idea of how it can work. So one of the sentence level activities is called because, but, and so. And this helps students learn to use those conjunctions But when it's embedded in content they're learning, it also reinforces their knowledge. So this is taken from a unit on ancient India, from that curriculum I mentioned, Core Knowledge, Language Arts. What this consists of, and this is a method that is designed to be used, adapted to any grade level, any subject matter. So what you could do is give students a sentence stem, the beginning of a sentence, that they need to complete with each of these different conjunctions. So if it's ancient India, you could use this. And each of these conjunctions requires students to retrieve a different kind of information from long-term memory. And but will be more difficult than because it's asking for contrasting information. So there are different possible answers, but here are some. I'll let you read through those. As you can see, students need to have this knowledge before they can do this activity, but it's a great way of reinforcing new information and new vocabulary. And as I mentioned, this is designed to be adapted to any subject matter. In fact, it works best if it is used across the curriculum, including in math class. So you could use the same activity if you're teaching about decimals and fractions. You could give them this sentence stem to complete. And it doesn't, math teachers might feel, well, I'm not a writing teacher, I don't want to take away from my math instruction, but what they see is this doesn't take away from their math instruction, it really makes it more powerful. And then science class. You could have, this is a different activity where students get a very simple sentence, they get some question words, and they need to put it all together to create an expanded sentence. But even this kind of writing can impose a cognitive load, especially with very young children. So you want to start with young children, certainly, or with whenever you're introducing a new grammatical concept, you want to start by doing it orally. So here's an example. This is a kindergarten unit about sound waves. This is, again, from Core Knowledge Language Arts. And so orally, the teacher could give them a sentence stem. You can't see sound waves because then the students could say, they are invisible. And the teacher could write that on the board. And this is laying the groundwork for later independent writing, and then using the but conjunction. But I want to make sure you understand that sentence level work is not just for kids. I mean, I think sometimes teachers at higher grade levels think, oh, my students need to be writing essays. They're too old to just write sentences. But the rigor of a sentence level activity depends on the content. So, for example, this guy is Immanuel Kant. He was an 18th century philosopher. I'm going to give you a sentence stem to complete. And, it's just a sentence, shouldn't be difficult. So, now, you need to know a lot about the philosophy of Immanuel Kant to complete that sentence. So it is not just for children. Okay, so I need to the method does go beyond sentences. I'm just going to go quickly through, but the sentence level work is what lays the foundation for later independent writing. It goes all the way through argumentative essays. And also another crucial phase in this is outlines. Teaching students explicitly how to create a linear outline, because writing at length imposes a cognitive load, and because you're thinking, wait, what was I going to say next? What did I already say? If you have an outline, it gives you a roadmap. You don't have to juggle that in working memory. And writing an outline is itself a knowledge deepening activity. I'll just quickly give you an example. So this is an example of a single paragraph outline that is part of the Writing Revolution method, but students are taught explicitly how to do each of the things involved in creating this outline. This is embedded in content about Martin Luther King. But so they will have been taught how to use an appositive, and they will have been taught that's a good way to construct a topic sentence. They will have been taught how to think of details that relate to that topic sentence and put them into note form with abbreviations, and that ensures that they process. They're not just copying, but they're processing the information. And then they learn about subordinating conjunction, and that's a good way to construct a topic or concluding sentence. And then if they stop here, they already have deepened their knowledge considerably about Martin Luther King. But if they want to turn it into a finished paragraph, now it's pretty easy. They transfer their topic and their concluding sentences. And then again, they draw on their sentence level skills to turn those notes into their detail sentences. And one of those skills is using transition words and phrases to connect their thoughts. And they might have learned how to do that in a different context, in a sentence level activity. So just to sum of that up, an effective curriculum, first of all, will focus on content and spend time, not just a day, but 2-3 weeks or more on a particular topic. Give all students access to the same complex text, so they're not limited to what they can read, decode themselves, and so that could be through read-alouds and discussion. And engage students in listening, speaking, reading, and writing about the same content. And why is that important? Well, I'll tell you. So if you have a curriculum that connects all 4 of those things, those 4 aspects of literacy, it enables students to read and write at a higher level. So, as I said, we have these 4 aspects of literacy, but there's a big difference between listening and speaking on the one hand and reading and writing on the other, because listening and speaking are easier. We don't have to teach children to do those things. We've evolved to do them as human beings, and what that means is, in themselves, they don't impose a burden on working memory. So that opens more capacity to take in new information, new vocabulary, and then if you read about the topic that you've just acquired knowledge about, you have more capacity to read it and write at a higher level because you're not also juggling new information at the same time. This only works if the curriculum has students reading and writing about the same topics they've been listening to and speaking about. So it's really crucial to connect all those things. And just briefly, I'm going to talk about some possible obstacles to change, because change is hard. And what I'm saying is likely to be new information for many teachers. And so it's natural, there could be intellectual obstacles. It's natural to be skeptical of something that contradicts everything you've heard. You may have heard, it's more important to teach skills. Knowledge, kids can just Google that stuff. And then there may be emotional obstacles, because if you've been teaching in a certain way for many years, thinking you are helping children, and someone comes along and says, maybe not, that's very painful to hear. It's not anybody's fault, it's a systemic problem, but we all raise barriers to taking in that kind of message. And then even if you want to change what you're doing in the classroom, there could be behavioral obstacles, obstacles of habit, because it's such a complex activity, teaching, that it's easy to slip back into long-standing habits. But teachers can overcome these obstacles. They're doing them as we speak, but they need some help. First, they need to know why change is necessary, because change is hard. If you don't understand why it's necessary, maybe you won't do it. They also need the what, the materials, the curriculum, so they don't have to come up with them themselves. And then they need the how. They need support in delivering those materials to their particular students in the best way. And that could look like coaching and collaborating among teachers. So, just briefly going to tell you about a story about a little boy who was in a school that was using one of these new curricula, core knowledge language arts, but they were still doing leveled reading. So they were using standardized tests to determine a student's reading level. And so you give the student a text on some topic he maybe knows nothing about, and determine his reading level based on whether he could read and understand that text. So this was a second grader, and the teacher knew this little boy struggled like crazy with reading, and she was giving him a test, but she saw in the kit, the testing kit, there was a text on the topic of westward expansion in the United States, and that happened to be the topic that the class had just spent 2 or 3 weeks learning about through reading aloud and discussion. But the text was at a 4th grade level, and this was a struggling 2nd grade reader. But just out of curiosity, the teacher gave the text to the boy and to see what he could do. And to her surprise, he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension, which meant it was really too easy for him under this formula she had. And I think that experience changed that teacher's idea of who that little boy was and what he was capable of doing. And it probably changed that little boy's idea of who he was as well. And this is one reason I feel so much urgency about this topic, is we are making, with the best of intentions, we are making untold numbers of children feel like they are failures, when in fact it's the system that's failed them. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you very much.